great to see you today. Jill Fander asked me to let you know again, we did make the announcement about signing up for the food kitchen this Wednesday. She said there is still room for volunteers. They still need some volunteers. So perhaps if you've never gave that a shot before, go ahead and stop by the social hall after worship and sign up. If you have questions, reach out to the church office. We'll let you know. It's really easy. Just a couple of hours. The Open Door Food Kitchen is downtown, and it's just a great team environment, a great way to serve our community and be the hands and feet of Christ. So if that gives you an idea, go for it and sign up after service. So we're going to be reading in a couple of passages today. Let me invite you just to turn to, we'll have the scriptures on the screen. If you are using the Pew Bibles, we have the page numbers there for you on the screen. If you would, just go ahead and find those scriptures, Romans 14, 1 through 8, and sort of hold your place there. And then also, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 will be the other scripture that we'll be in. And so kind of find those places and hold them for just a moment. The topic of today's message, again, we are doing a sermon series called Summer Smorgasbord. Questions came from the congregation about topics and scriptures that you were wanting me to talk about. And so the topic today is something along the lines of, is it okay for Christians to purchase or buy products from companies that perhaps go against our Christian convictions, companies that maybe have different ideologies that we might have as Christians? Is it okay to support such companies and businesses? And so here are two scriptures. We're going to read these, and then we'll talk about them. Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 8. Paul says, "Accept those whose faith is weak without quarreling or disputable matters. One person's faith allows them to eat everything, but another person whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted that person. Who are you to judge someone else's servants? To their own master they stand or fall, and they will stand for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some consider one day more sacred than another. Others consider every day alike. Everyone should be fully convinced in their own mind. Those who regard one day as special do so to the Lord. Those who eat meat do so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And those who abstain do so to the Lord and give thanks to God. For we do not live to ourselves alone, and we do not die to ourselves alone. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord." Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We'll read verses 1 through 3. Paul is writing to the Christians in the city of Corinth. He says, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that even the pagans do not tolerate. A man has his father's wife, and you are proud. Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put that person out of fellowship for the man who has been doing this? For my part, even though I am not physically present, I am with you in spirit, as one who is present with you in this way. I have already passed judgment in the name of the Lord Jesus on the one who has been doing this." Now go down to verse 9 of the same chapter, 1 Corinthians 5. He says, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with any who claim to be fellow believers, but are sexually immoral or greedy, idolaters or slanderers, drunkards or swindlers. With such persons do not even eat. What business is it of mine to judge those outside of the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you." We're going to get into this here in just a minute. But back in the early 90s, a man came into our church. He was a fellow worshiper of the congregation that we were in. And he approached us with flyers asking everyone in the congregation to boycott all Procter & Gamble products. Does anyone remember this, maybe from the 90s? Was anyone ever asked to boycott Procter & Gamble products? If you didn't know, Procter & Gamble is the parent company for many popular household brands that cover everything from personal hygiene to household cleaning products to medicine. I would be willing to bet that there is not one person in this building here today who doesn't have at least one Procter & Gamble item in your house. I would be willing to bet that. So back in the 90s, Procter & Gamble was even over a bunch of food and beverage companies as well. So it was much more sweeping back in the 90s. And the story went like this. The president of Procter & Gamble went on the Phil Donahue show and said that because society is so open about everything, he wanted to confess that Procter & Gamble was sending most of their profits to the Church of Satan, of which he was a proud and active member. Now, when asked by Phil Donahue on the show about whether he was concerned about losing profits because of this admission, he reportedly said, "There are not enough Christians in the U.S. to make a difference." So these flyers spread like wildfire throughout our church, and we got up in arms. We were excited. We were going to boycott against Procter & Gamble. We were asked to go home, find every Procter & Gamble item in the house, and throw it out, and to immediately cease purchasing any P&G product. So we got home, and my family never made a bonfire and threw out any of our Procter & Gamble brands. In fact, our church continued to still buy Folgers coffee and serve Folgers coffee. You wouldn't believe it if I told you, but this was nothing more than a conspiracy theory. I can see the shock on your faces right now. This was before the internet, before personal computers, before the ability to send email forwards. It was much harder to spread conspiracy theories back then, but it was not impossible. In fact, this one conspiracy theory about Procter & Gamble sending all of their profits and money to the Church of Satan actually started back in the 80s, in the early 80s. And so the one that we came across in the 90s, when I was young and growing up in the church, it was the same story from the 80s, just reheated and served up again. The Procter & Gamble president never went on the Phil Donahue show. He never made such a confession and certainly did not funnel their profits to the Church of Satan. The question is, if that was true, if the president of Procter & Gamble actually did go on the Phil Donahue show and say all of those things, would it be okay then for Christians to continue to purchase those items and not fear judgment from other Christians or being pushed out of the churches that they belong to? When I pastored a church in Darlington, Indiana, it was my first pastorate, one of the ladies gave me a recipe for beer-battered fish. I went to Walmart to go buy the beer, and I was afraid of anyone in the congregation seeing me going to the beer aisle. So I calculated the closest door to the beer aisle. I felt like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. I put on a ball cap and pulled it down kind of low. So afraid that someone would catch me going into Walmart and buying beer for my beer-battered fish. And that's all I did with it, okay? That's all I did with it. A Baptist pastor friend of mine once told me that Jews don't recognize Jesus, Protestants don't recognize the Pope, and Baptists don't recognize one another in the liquor store. It's just a rule of thumb there for you. And I say that we love our Baptist friends, right? So it doesn't matter. We love our Baptist friends. So the question stands before us today, and it is a good question. This question is it okay to buy products, support companies whose ideology is not compatible with our Christian convictions? A few years ago, I posted something on Facebook about a trip to Starbucks and a church member proceeded to tell me that she will never spend another dollar at Starbucks because of where they stand politically. I assured her that I always get the non-political brew, so it was okay. It's fine. My coffee's not going to turn me into a Democrat or a Republican. It's cool. As most of you know, I love Chick-fil-A. I'm a big fan of Chick-fil-A, and I've been told that if I buy Chick-fil-A products that I am against marriage equality of any kind. So whether getting coffee from Starbucks or a chicken sandwich from Chick-fil-A, there's always something to accuse somebody of if you want to. So accuse me of being a coffee snob if you want it. I mean, I can take it. Tell me that I need to lose weight and need to stop eating chicken sandwiches. That is fair. I get it. If you don't hear anything else this morning, this is the too long didn't listen statement for you. God looks at our hearts. God alone is the one who can see the motivation that lies beneath everything that we do. And God is the only one who can judge us accordingly. In the Romans text that we read this morning, Paul is dealing with Christians who were living in the Roman Empire. And one of the issues was this: if you went to the local market in the city that you lived in, there was a good chance that the meat that you purchased was first sacrificed on an altar to a pagan god. And so the accusation went like this: if you bought and ate meat that came from the market in the city, most likely it was a part of some pagan ritual before it got to the market. And so in essence, the accusation was, you are worshiping whatever deity that animal was sacrificed in honor of. And so some Christians probably thought that by abstaining from buying this meat in the marketplace, at the very least, it would prevent Christian money from going to non-Christians and pagans who worshiped other gods in the temple. Now, this was a big deal for first century Christians. It might sound kind of crazy. You're like, what's the deal about eating meat or not eating meat? In the first century for the Christians, in Acts chapter 15, there was a council that was called. And this council of these big church leaders, Peter would have been one of them, they were called to discuss about when Gentiles come into the church, what are the rules that Gentiles are bound to? What sort of Jewish dietary laws go along with the Gentiles as they come into the faith? And one of the items on this list from Acts 15:29 was to abstain from foods sacrificed to idols. That was on the list there. Abstain from foods sacrificed to idols. Now, as Christianity grew and as it spread out into other regions and other cities, the debate about whether eating meat from the marketplace grew even stronger. Because some would say it is impossible to know what meat in the marketplace was sacrificed in a temple ritual and which was not. And some Christians would say, well, since we don't know what meat was sacrificed, we shouldn't eat meat unless it comes farm to table, right? Unless you know who butchered it and who sent it to the market, you should not eat meat. And so that was one of the arguments in the early church. And so Paul's words again in Romans that we read, he says, one person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. He's not saying that vegetarians are weak. That's not what he's saying in this passage. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does. For God has accepted them. He's accepted them both. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. So in essence, Paul is saying that if you abstain from eating meat, then do so as a devotion to God. Give thanks to God as one who does not eat meat. On the flip side, if you do eat meat, if you buy meat from the marketplace, do so as an act of devotion to God. Do so giving thanks to God, for God is the one who has given us all that we have in the first place. And so Paul doesn't pass along sort of a one-size-fits-all rule, which would be easier for me to just stand up here and say, this is what Paul says, don't do it, right? But there's not this one-size-fits-all rule book. Instead, Paul calls on us to be the judge of ourselves and the conscience that we have, the convictions that we have about certain things, that we work those out between us and God. Whereas this one issue of eating meat in the early church might have been enough to split an entire church, Paul is telling the Christians to live out your convictions. Indeed, live out your convictions. If there's a company that makes clothes that you're not comfortable with how they produce those clothing, then by all means, live out your convictions and don't buy products from those companies. But work out those convictions as something between you and God, and have grace for other people who would make other decisions, especially in this area of buying and selling things within this culture. So that's Romans 14. In our 1 Corinthians text, the overarching issue was sexual sins. And you're like, what does this have to do with what we're talking about today? The first century Roman culture was inundated with sex. There were temples that were built to goddesses where the entire point was to worship the goddess. You go into the temple and it is in essence a brothel. It was acceptable to worship these goddesses in such a manner. One of the other practices of the day is that older, more wealthy men would do that. It was called pederasty, where they would, even though they had wives, these older, more wealthy men would choose younger males with whom to be intimate with. And it was mainly just for sport, it was for hobby, it was for nothing more than that. Sex was also used in a manner in that culture to show someone who was the boss. If you had a slave or a servant that you wanted to remind them who was in charge, sex was used in so many ways in that culture. And so, keeping all of that in mind of how prevalent sex was in the First Corinthian time, Paul says this in his letter, chapter 5, verse 1 through 2. He says, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that even the pagans do not tolerate." And he says, "And you are proud." He says, there's something going on in your church that even the outside world, even non-Christians would say, that's not right. And he says, and you're proud about this. And so specifically, Paul is addressing this instance in the church where a man was sleeping with his father's wife. We don't know if that was his mother or his stepmother, but that was specifically the instance that Paul mentions. And he says that this would have been something that even the pagans would have said, yeah, you shouldn't do that kind of stuff. And so here in chapter 5, Paul, he talks about a previous letter. Before he sent, the 1 Corinthians is the first letter that we have in the Bible. Before he sent that one, there was another one that he sent to the Corinthian church. And in that letter, he told the Corinthian Christians not to tolerate this kind of sexual immorality within the church. Paul told them to expel such people from the church because whether it's sexual immorality or any other immorality that someone is boastful of and prideful of, he says it's like yeast in a lump of dough. He says it just spreads like wildfire and it infects the entire lump of dough. And so at some point, the Corinthian Christians must have taken Paul's words not to associate with the sexually immoral in the church, and they began to not associate with anyone outside of the church who was sexually immoral. And so the question is, as people who have been called to be salt in this world, is salt any good if it stays within the salt shaker? I wonder if Paul saw a 1 Corinthian church that became so inward and so closed off because they were afraid to associate with anyone outside of the church. Anyone that they said, well, this is a sinner, this person is sexually immoral, or immoral in any other way, that these Christians, not only were they kicking out sinners in the church, but then they were having nothing to do with the world around them. And so perhaps that's the unintended consequence of Paul's words about not tolerating sexual immorality in the church, as it caused the Christians to live these inward and secluded lives, separated from their neighbors out of fear of coming into contact with sinners, thinking that, well, if I come into contact with another sinner, then it makes me a sinner. And so perhaps this is the kind of thinking that some modern Christians struggle with when deciding who to do business with, who to buy and sell things from. And as we all know, we live in a free market society where we have the freedom to choose what companies to support and which ones to avoid. And sometimes it is as simple as something as saying, I like their coffee. Their coffee tastes good. Or I like their chicken sandwiches. Don't hate me for liking chicken sandwiches, right? So back to our question. Does buying something from a company that espouses views or beliefs that are contrary to our Christian convictions make us complicit in what they believe and what they do? Does engaging in any kind of business with people who are outside of the church and who have many different beliefs, does that contaminate us as Christians? First of all, let's remember the Romans 14 text. We are all responsible for our own convictions. My friends, live by the convictions that you have, but also remember it's not our place to take our convictions and place these personal matters and force them upon everyone else around us. Let's look at Paul's response to the Christians in Corinth who really had taken his words to the extreme, where they seemingly were not dealing with anyone outside of the church. Paul says to them, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Now get this, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy and the swindlers or idolaters. In that case, he says, you would have to leave the world. If you couldn't associate or do business with anyone outside of the church who was immoral in any way, he says, you'd have to leave this world. But now I'm writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister but is sexually immoral or greedy. And then he goes on, or an idolater, or a slanderer, a drunkard, or a swindler. Do not even eat with such people. He's talking about people in the church, people who are proud of their sins, who are flaunting their sins, who want to just say, hey, accept me and my wrong living, and just give me a blessing to live in these ways. So do you hear what Paul is saying in these difficult texts? We would have to leave this world if we were so worried about associating with or doing business with people and companies who hold to different beliefs and convictions than us. Have you ever heard someone say this phrase, Christians are supposed to be in, but not of the world? Have you ever heard someone say that before? You know where that comes from? I was curious this week because I was thinking about that. It actually comes from John 17 as Jesus prays for his disciples. It's Jesus' last recorded prayer before his crucifixion. And not only is Jesus praying for his current disciples at that time, he's praying for all of the disciples who would come after him. And in this prayer, what Jesus prays in John 17:15, he says, as you sent me, as you, God, sent me into the world, I have sent them. Jesus has sent us, his disciples, into the world. He's asking God not to take his followers out of the world, even though we are not of this world. Even though our citizenship is found in heaven, Jesus is saying, as you have sent me into the world, God, send your disciples into this world. During Jesus' ministry on earth, he spent time with sinners. He spent time with people who were immoral, people who were outcasts, drunkards, prostitutes. The list could go on. And because Jesus spent so much time with these people that needed grace, that needed love, that needed a second chance, because he was enfleshed in the communities of people who were considered outsiders and evildoers and wrongdoers, in Luke 7:34, there is this accusation that Jesus is a glutton. Jesus is a drunkard. He's a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Because Jesus realized that his ministry, he couldn't leave this world. It put him in contact with people who were immoral. I heard this quote from Joshua Harris, who was a Christian author years ago. He said this quote, he said, be like Jesus. Spend enough time with sinners to ruin your reputation with religious people. Be like Jesus. Spend enough time with sinners to ruin your reputation with religious people. There's got to be a balance in there for us, my friends, as we work out what does it look like to live in the kingdom of heaven while living in this world, while living in this day and age. We go out into this world as those who are sent by Jesus, living by the convictions that that we work out between ourselves and God. We go forth as salt, called forth to season and preserve the world around us. We go forth as light, and if there's anything about light that tells us about our mission, it's that light goes into the darkness. Light is not afraid of the darkness. And so, my friends, whether we are at work, whether we are at play, whether we are doing business, buying and selling, we do so as ambassadors of the King of heaven. I love these words in closing from Paul in 2 Corinthians. He says that we are the aroma of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. You are the aroma of Christ in this world. What an interesting thing for Paul to say. And so as we think about, oftentimes, maybe it's backwards when we think, if we spend time out in the world and do business with people in the world and people who aren't Christians, how will it affect me? Oftentimes that's what Christians think. But maybe we can turn that around and say, how would our world be affected? How would our world be changed? How would our community look if we took serious our calling as disciples to go out and be the aroma of Christ in work and in play and in business? And so, my friends, by the grace of God, through the power of the Holy Spirit, may we go forth and smell like Christ in this world that is dying and hurting and in darkness.